We're really happy to have our guest, Tom Clavin, here. He's a best-selling author, I don't know if you knew, but of many, many books. Many nonfiction books, primarily on American military history, sports, and entertainment. He previously worked as a newspaper editor and writer, including for the New York Times for 15 years. And a number of his books have been New York Times bestsellers. Today he's here to talk about his latest book, Throne of Grace, a mountain man, an epic adventure in the bloody conquest of the American West. Please welcome Tom Clavin.
I just want to read one paragraph or something. When I was reviewing the book again, it struck me that Bob Drury and I waited until page, let's see if I have the page number right, 243, to one paragraph sort of describe why we ended up writing this book, Throne of Grace. Over the course of, this is after Jedediah Smith has come back from his most epic journey. Over the course of 12 months, Jedediah Smith had become the first European American to lead a party across the Mojave Desert, over the Sierra Nevada, and through North America's Great Basin. His subsequent reports of these extraordinary travels, brimming with detailed geographic, topographic, military, cultural, and political observations, were soon being pored over by America's fledgling military-industrial complex. Particularly interested in the obscure mountain man's insights on men Smith had never heard of, statesmen and railroad entrepreneurs, army officers and mining magnates, already envisioning a transcontinental land bridge connecting the eastern seaboard to the golden shores of California. What's that basically saying is that Jedediah Smith, who many people had not heard of, was just this amazing explorer who, in the wake of Lewis and Clark. I compare him to Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark, beginning in 1803 to 1806, they left St. Louis and they made this journey all through, up the Missouri River, all across, and came out on the West Coast. They wintered there and made the journey basically following the same route back and arrived back in St. Louis in, I think it was September 1806. To great fanfare, deservedly so. The Corps of Discovery Expedition is just an amazing feat of human achievement. Now, some years later, and there were some other explorers, there was Zebulon Pike, there's some others in there, but Jedediah Smith ended up making 3 cross-country journeys. Each time he took a different route that basically follow the routes that we have today in Interstates 90, 80, and 70. He went the northern way, then on the West Coast and came back. He went the middle way, and he went the southwest way, which including, as I mentioned, became the first man that, as far as anybody knew, crossed the Mojave Desert and survived and came out on the other side and showed up in the area of San Diego. So that was a big reason why we wanted to do this book, is because we thought we had discovered somebody that was an important character who has mostly been overlooked in the history books. One of our previous books that Bob Drury and I did was called Blood and Treasure. And when you do the subtitle, you know, Daniel Boone and the such and such and such, it's like, yeah, Daniel Boone, we know that. You know, Fess Parker, Coonskin Cap, and stuff like that, which is not that it's true. But you have the immediate name recognition. But here we are dealing with somebody who was an extraordinary explorer and adventurer. And you say, Jedediah Smith. Who? Who's that? Is that my great-grand uncle? Was he on Bonanza? No, I don't know who Jedediah Smith was. So that was a big reason for doing this. The book is that we wanted to show how he was a Lewis and Clark. He was a Kit Carson. He was a Daniel Boone. He was a Davy Crockett. He was all of these things. He didn't get the kind of recognition in the history books and in the popular culture that these other fellows did. Another reason for doing this book was originally started out that both my co-author and our publisher thought that I was being kind of crazy when I suggested this. We finished Blood and Treasure, the book about Daniel Boone, which basically covers the period from 1760 to 1820 when Daniel Boone dies. And we had previously done a book some years ago that you may be familiar with called The Heart of Everything That Is, which is another one that has a lot of American Indian point of view, which basically covers the period from about 1850 to 1870. So, okay, so we finished Blood and Treasure. We're already under contract to do a book that became The Last Hill. And any of you are not familiar with that, The Last Hill, it's a World War II story about the 2nd Army Ranger Company battalion adventures in the late 1944, right up against the German border. They were like an elite team of soldiers that were sent to take this Hill 400, which became like sort of like an Alamo for both sides, both the Germans and the Americans, because they kept taking it and retaking it, taking it and retaking it. And so when we were finishing that book, we had already started working on another World War II story about a Marine Corps major who kept being dropped behind, he's known as the Phantom, dropped behind enemy lines in Europe. And one of the things that makes this story remarkable to us, in addition to many things, and especially this character, is that the Marines were confined to the Pacific theater. So what's this Marine Corps major doing dropping behind enemy lines in occupied France and in Germany? So we started working on that, and then one day, it's something like a bolt of lightning, or maybe it was just a mini stroke. I got this idea. I said, well, something is missing. Something is missing between Blood and Treasure, which ends in 1820, and the story of Red Cloud and the Lakota Sioux, which begins in 1850. There's a 30-year period where so much changed in America. So much territory was explored, so much territory was taken away from the Native Americans. So many excursions and voyages and journeys were held. And really, by Jedediah Smith's journeys to the West Coast and back several times, as I said, the route that would be followed by his interstates, it was for the first time really the Atlantic and the Pacific coast of the United States were joined together. It was that almost like that land bridge that went from New York and Philadelphia and Boston all the way out to what would become San Francisco, what would become Los Angeles, or was San Diego. So I got a conference call with my editor and with Bob and said, I think that we have an obligation here. And it would be fun. That's very important. And it would be fun. If you're going to spend 2 or 3 years with the book, you're going to be having fun. To complete a trilogy. We have a trilogy. And it would be Blood and Treasure in chronological order, the book that became Throne of Grace, and then The Heart of Everything That Is. And thankfully, Bob, even though he loved the World War II idea, the new one we'd started working on, he said, I think you're right. I think it's time to go back to early America and complete a story that feels like, he said, I feel the same way, there's been something missing. So our editor was like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. You know, you guys are under contract for a book you've already started, you're saying you want to put it, cancel it. No, not cancel it, just put it aside. We really feel drawn to telling the story, that's what we did. So that's another big reason for that this book exists, is because we decided that we had a trilogy that basically covers the expansion of America, both the good and the bad that brought about, from approximately 1760 to 1870, when Red Cloud goes to Washington, D.C. and realizes the Indians have no chance, basically. There's not much that we can do against the military-industrial complex that America was becoming. So that's why it exists. So I'm not saying, they're all standalone books. So I'm not suggesting, well, if you're going to read one, you got to read all 3. You really don't have to. You can pick any one. Because they were written originally as standalone books, not as a sequel, not as a trilogy. But you have to read the sequel after you finish one. So that was a big reason for doing it. Another reason why we thought that it would make a good adventure tale and be a page turner is one of the words in the subtitle, Bloody Conquest. And I want to read a very short piece here, but here's just one example of what we mean by that. Okay. Involving a couple of our mountain man characters. John Coulter. Have you ever heard of John Coulter? No? You have. He's an amazing character because he was a very important member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1803 to 1806. And he was actually, they were getting close to St. Charles, Missouri, on the way back, the last leg of their trip back home. And they encountered on the Missouri River a couple of guys in a canoe that were heading up Missouri River, back where he came from. And so, they stopped and, what are you guys going? He said, we're going back up there, we're going to be fur trappers, we're going to explore. He went from one boat to the next and said, okay, I'm going back with you guys. So without ending up getting back to St. Louis and St. Charles, he went and hopped on another boat, off he went. They stayed in the mountains for something like 15 years. And there's a famous story called Coulter's Run, where, let me just read this part that he's in here. That fall, having recovered from his wound, John Coulter and his old Corps of Discovery companion John Potts set off in 2 canoes to trap the same Three Forks region. They were paddling north on the Jefferson when a painted band of Blackfeet appeared on the east bank and motioned them ashore. Coulter slipped his traps into the shallow water and complied. Potts refused, even after he was shot and wounded. Watching the Indians disarm and strip Coulter naked, Potts managed to level his rifle and fire, knocking one of the Blackfeet from his horse. A cloud of arrows perforated Potts and his canoe. Coulter saw great daubs of his friend's blood stain the river, and as both Potts and his floundering crest slipped beneath the surface. Indian swimmers dived in the river to recover Potts' body and drag it onto the bank. Coulter watched as the corpse was hacked to pieces and beheaded. So Coulter figures it's the same as in store for him. This is where what became known as Coulter's Run began. They said to him, all right, I'll tell you what, there's like 15 of us and one of you, you're naked, you have no weapons, you got nothing. We feel a little sorry for you. And it's not, you're not making much of a challenge for us in your situation. We'll give you a head start. Start running. And we'll count to 10 and we'll count to 20, whatever it is we're going to do. Coulter doesn't hesitate. He just takes off through the woods. He kept going for 300 miles. He eventually killed a couple of Indians chasing him. The rest finally just gave up because they were getting out of their territory into like Shoshone territory or something like that. And he finally shows up like 11 days later at this fort. He's totally naked. He's covered with all kinds of cuts and bruises and everything. He's exhausted and malnourished. And the people looking out of the fort didn't know if he was a man or a beast. That became what was known as Coulter's Run. Also a character in here, you know, so that's a bloody part, but another reason why we did the book, there's so many cool characters in here. By cool, I mean they're interesting. The mountain men, they had no idea, many of them are illiterate. And the reason why the vast majority, if not, you can maybe safely say all of them, the possible exception of Jedediah Smith, were mountain men is because that's the way you could make really good money back in the 1820s and into the 1830s. The most prized beast or animal in the American West was the beaver. Because in Europe, they were making tens of thousands of beaver hats and scarves. The demand was insatiable. So if you could go out there and trap beaver and bring their skins back, you could sell them for pretty decent money. And making the equivalent today, what some of these guys could make the equivalent today of about $400,000. Now, it's not going to buy you a house in Sag Harbor, but real estate was a lot cheaper back in 1825. So a lot of these characters ended up as mountain men, and John Coulter became one, Thomas Brokenhand Fitzpatrick, Jim Bridger. Hugh Glass is one of our characters. And Hugh Glass, if that name doesn't ring a bell, think of Leo DiCaprio. Because some of you have seen the movie The Revenant, but his character was Hugh Glass. And so we tell an abbreviated form of his story in this book, that he was mauled badly by a grizzly bear, left for dead, and it was weeks afterwards that he finally showed up back at a fort. Everybody was astonished that he was alive. And what kept him alive is he was going to get revenge on the two guys that had abandoned him. When he finally got back and confronted them, he said, by this point, his experiences of being a very changed man, he said, I forgive you. It's a really wonderful story, and if you've seen The Revenant, it tells a good part of the story. But he's a character in our book, too. We have the early days of Kit Carson. He was originally started out as a mountain man. We have Mike Fink. Mike bring us dim bell, people of a certain age. He was the captain of the Gully Wumper on the Disney show back in the 1950s. Big Mike Fink. He's a character with a very unusual story in the book. So you have all these guys that they were mostly illiterate, they were out there to make money, yet they were the ones who were spreading west, extending the boundary of America, extending the frontier boundary of America. From what had initially been the Mississippi River became the Missouri River, became Kansas, became Nebraska, became Colorado, became Utah, became New Mexico, became Arizona. And because they were, as part of their hunting trips, they were seeing things that no European white man had ever seen before. Jim Bridger found this huge body of salt water. He thought he was at the Pacific Ocean. It was the Great Salt Lake. Jed Smith found what was called the South Pass, which enabled people to go through the Rocky Mountains that had to go over them, go through the South Pass. And you could do it with wagons, too. That opened up what eventually became the Oregon Trail. So each one of these guys has a story. They have all kinds of adventures together. There's conflicts that they're involved in with each other, with Indian tribes. You also have rather important Indian characters too, because they're the ones who are bearing the brunt of what they were seeing eventually became an invasion. Every time they turned around, there were more white guys wearing, beaver coats and buffalo hides and things like that, who were not only killing their buffalo, but starting to build forts in their territory, in their hunting grounds. So that's, I think that was another big reason why we wanted to tell the story and fill in that middle part of the trilogy, because we wanted to, it wasn't like, we crossed over the Mississippi River, started sending out explorers and mountain men, and next thing you know, we covered the whole lower 48. There was a process there. It was it was a bloody conquest. We used the word conquest deliberately. Another thing I think that we wanted to do with this book that people I think will get out of it is a major character is the American West itself. I mean, if any of us explore the American West today, we mostly do it by car or camper van, RV. We make stops at trailer parks and or Motel 6s. I know they still exist. You eat at Stuckey's and there's different chains that are out there. But, so that's the American West for the most part today. The American West as portrayed in this book in mostly 1820s, very different. I mean, a lot of it was just, I don't want to say undiscovered country because that implies, there were already people living there, so it was not undiscovered. But it was being discovered for the first time by European Americans who were mostly white. And they were seeing these amazing, the Rocky Mountains, they were seeing the Grand Tetons, they were seeing the Pikes Peak, they were seeing the Salt Lake, they were seeing the Mojave Desert, they were seeing the Great Basin in northern Nevada and Utah. All these things, they were just astonished by what they were seeing. And we try in the book to portray that as accurately as possible so that when a character is walking through, I mean, even when they're in the Great Peril, there's one scene where Jed Smith and his two companions all had left after they made their way all the way from St. Louis, and now they're in the Mojave Desert. And it gets so bad that what they do is, for the rest of the daytime, they walk as far as they can in the daytime until it gets too hot. Then they bury themselves up to their necks in sand because it's a way to stay cool. And then when the night falls, they dig themselves out again and keep going until it's time to dig themselves up to their necks. And to have that described is just, to me, was very fulfilling to be able to tell the story and really feel like you're transported to 1823 Colorado or 1825 Minnesota, and some of the, or 1826 Southern California or New Mexico or Arizona. So that's a big part of it. We wanted to make sure that we portrayed accurately what America was like in that period of time. I think there was one other or two other reasons I wanted to mention. I had to bring my notes because I went on when this book came out, which was in May 7th, so this just a couple months ago. And I felt like I knew every part of it intimately from the back of my hand because it had just come out, I just reread it. And I went on a book tour, and it was an interesting book tour because it was 6 events, 7 flights, and 7 days. So every day I was talking about the book. And then that was the last event. Well, then actually we came back and Bob and I, who's up here, he lives in Manasquan, New Jersey. Maybe you know where Manasquan, New Jersey is. He came up here and we did a talk at the Barnes & Noble in Bridgehampton on May 18th. So I hadn't really had a chance to talk about the book yet, so I said, I gotta bring my notes. I went over here and say, oh yeah, but I can't forget that part 2. I guarantee it's good. So, and then there was Jedediah Smith himself. As we researched more, we just became more and more surprised, and pleasantly so, at what a dramatic, dynamic character he was. He wasn't a larger-than-life character, like you could say of somebody like a Daniel Boone. He was rather rail-thin. He usually came from New England. But at the age of 23, he showed up to St. Louis and said, I want to go on an adventure. And this guy named William Ashley, who was lieutenant governor of Missouri, was just starting an expedition up the Missouri River to search for beaver skins. He said, well, come along with us. And that began a period of the next, in 1822, the next 9 years of constantly going back and forth across the country, having different adventures, encountering different Indian tribes, barely escaping death over and over and over again. And he kept journals, some of which survived. So we were able, finally, thankfully, to get first-hand accounts. Somebody like a Daniel Boone, for example, did not keep a journal. You know, he was literate. It wasn't like he couldn't write. Jedediah Smith had received a very good education, and probably he could have stayed in New England and become an attorney or some other professional, but he wanted an adventure. And so he spent the next 9 years having these adventures in up the Missouri River, other rivers, Snake River, back to the West Coast, coming back to the East, St. Louis, back to the West Coast. And thankfully, because of his diary entries, a lot of what people who came after him knew what was ahead, knew what kind of flowers there were, knew what kind of animals there were, what kind of predators there were, what kind of signposts there were. So he was a rather religious man. And I think one of the things that helped him is that he always felt that if he tried his hardest, you know, this old work ethic, we will survive. I just work really hard, do my best, and I live a good life. He's one of the few mountain men. Mountain men routinely had one or several wives belonging to the tribes out there, the Crows, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet. And Smith didn't do that. His idea was, I'm going to be when the time comes that I finish my travels, I'm going to hopefully have accumulated enough money that I'm going to go back home. By this point, his family members are living in Illinois. And I'm going to start a farm, I'm going to get married and have kids. So that was kind of like an idealistic goal because of all the dangerous situations he put himself in, but he kept just wiggling out of them. So I want to read one last thing. That's probably going to prompt some questions, and if you do have any questions, please ask them, because there's only so many things I can think of to mention about the book, and I love when we keep people answering questions. I was at Rainy Day Books in Kansas City back in May, and when the moderator or the host of the talk said, how about you just sit here and people ask you questions, I was like, great, ask away. And I made the mistake of saying, you can ask me anything. Oh, how much do you get paid per book? But I don't have any secrets, so fine, you can ask me whatever you want. Sadly, I don't have any secrets. The hole was dry. This is taking place in May 1831. The hole was dry. Jed Smith was discouraged, not surprised. He had been warned about this stretch of the Santa Fe Trail. The old-timers call it the water scrape, for good reason. Smith and his lead scout, the Irish-born Thomas Fitzpatrick, dismounted and ran their fingers through the clumpy alluvium at the bottom of the wash. The granules were cool, damp. Fitzpatrick unsheathed his long-handled fleshing knife and began scraping for an underground spring. Smith, climbing back to the lip, raised the spyglass and swept the horizon. It was May 1831, and months of severe drought had rendered the entire Southwest parched and brown. Even the Arkansas River, where their wagon train had topped off its water jugs before crossing into Mexican territory, had been but hip deep. Those jugs, lashed beneath the 22 Murphy freight wagons laden with trade goods, had been empty going on 4 days now. By the time Smith and Fitzpatrick plunged ahead in their search, the swollen tongues of the wagon wheels were lolling out of their mouths. Even Smith's and Fitzpatrick's mounts, sturdy Mustangs, evolved to ride for days without water, had begun to wobble close to staggering. Imagine what it must be like to be going through the desert and you're already 4 days out of the last night out of any water. Smith reckoned they were perhaps 12 miles out ahead of the caravan. Over the nearly 10 years in which he had traversed the far west mountains and deserts, its prairies and forests, he had developed an innate sense of direction, especially distances, whether covered or yet to be traveled. He knew the Cimarron River had to be near. He squinted through his spyglass. The scraggly yucca, a purple bloom of sage, a sagging cottonwood, would mean they were close. But no vegetation appeared for as far as he could see. All was still. The only movement came from the ever-shifting sand piles, the eerie walking hills, carried on their never-ending journey by the blistering south wind. A stretch of broken ground, twisted and faulted and seeming to snake through a series of knobby rises, finally caught Smith's attention. Some 3 miles distant, nearly due south, rocks? Like the subterranean Mojave he knew all too well, the Cimarron was a dry river, its flow disappearing beneath a gravelly bed for months at a time, only to resurface after heavy rains, or when forced upward by an immovable impediment, like non-permeable rock. Smith, saving his saliva, tossed a pedal to catch Fitzpatrick's attention. I like that little detail there. You know, he could have just gone to Fitzpatrick, who was probably standing 5 feet away, and said, I'm going to check that out. That would cost saliva. So he picked a pebble and like bounced off his head or something, motioned this way. He swung his chin toward the craggy heights. The Irishman, hard as hickory bark, understood. The two had been boon companions since their initial trip up the Missouri and into the mountains during what seemed like a lifetime ago. Words were not needed. Fitzpatrick would continue to dig, awaiting the arrival of the desperate wagon train. Smith would ride south. Fitzpatrick watched through his own spyglass until his friend's silhouette vanished beneath the rim of a distant arroyo. Smith was within a half a mile of the rounded bluffs when the riders showed themselves. Through the shimmering heat haze, Smith counted 15, maybe 20. Comanche or Kiowa, he could not be certain. It was said that a veteran plainsman could tell the difference by studying the ornate stitching adorning their buckskin leggings and moccasins. Smith's attention was more focused on the sunlight glinting up the metallic blue barrels of their rifles and the steel-tipped points of their buffalo lances. In his time on the borderlands, Jed Smith had absorbed an irrefutable truth foreign to most Easterners. There was no single amorphous mass of Indians inhabiting the North American West. Each of the scores, if not hundreds of tribes scattered across the continent, had its own customs, its own ritual beliefs, its own often violent views toward outsiders, particularly whites. This was an interesting bit of knowledge for America at this time, too, because they're, for the most part, people all along the East Coast, where the vast majority of the population of America was, they believed, they'd heard about the Indians on the other side of the Mississippi and then eventually the Missouri River. They assumed, a lot of people assumed that Indians were just one huge tribe. Like, there was just one tribe of Indians. There was just one Indians group. And they all probably spoke the same language, they had the same customs and everything, same religion, stuff like that. A big part of Jedediah Smith's diaries and his adventures, as some of them were reported back in East Coast newspapers, is that he encountered hundreds of tribes. You know, you can start with Rickaroo, with A, all the way to Z, and have names of dozens and dozens and dozens of Indian tribes, which is a great revelation to America at that time. And each expected to be dealt, they often had violent views towards outsiders, particularly whites. Each expected to be dealt with on its own terms. In this case, however, any difference was moot. The Comanche and Kiowa had long formed a military alliance that had evolved into the most feared and powerful entity across the southern plains. Riding and fighting as one, they had cowed first the Spanish and then the Mexicans, and had even driven off the mighty Apache. Presently, with wagon traffic increasing on the thin ribbon of trail connecting St. Louis to Santa Fe that bisected their lands, they had begun to wage war on the trespassing Americans. Jed Smith had sharpened his battle instincts to a fine edge in the lethal confrontations with peoples as disparate as the Arikara and Blackfeet, the Mojave, and the Arapaho. He recognized when it was time to flee, time to fight, time to negotiate. The band he now studied set atop stout, well-worn ponies that would easily overtake his own hobbling horse. To run would be futile, and given their number, combat, even if he could find cover, appeared equally bootless, which left talk. Jed Smith drew his long-barreled Creamer rifle from his elk-skin scabbard, balanced it across the rise behind his saddle horn, and spurred his mount forward. It was his only play. And if you want to know what happens, you got to read the book. Okay, so that's my lecture part of the presentation. I certainly hope there are some questions about either this book, any other books of mine, any of the books that I've done with George Bob Drury, the publishing industry, stock market. Please go ahead and ask questions. Yes, sir.
How do you go about doing the research for a book like this, where it's so hard to find things, I would guess?
You know, I would answer that question today a lot differently than I would answer 15 years ago. Because 15 years ago required a lot more hands-on research by going to, you know, for example, when I was working on The Heart of Everything That Is, which was in 2011 and 2012, to find a lot of information like diaries of Teamster wives and U.S. Army Scouts and other documents like that and little books they kept, you actually had to go around and find them. You know, I remember being on like what I call the Trail of Red Cloud for something like 3 weeks, landing in Omaha, renting a car, and doing 2,500 miles in the Dakotas and Wyoming and Colorado and I don't think I got to Montana, Nebraska. And I'd stop in these little local libraries and local history collections. I remember one in particular, Sheridan, Wyoming, where the curator, I think she was just on, whoever the librarian was on duty that day, said, well, here's something that might be of interest to you. And she came back with this diary from 1866 that a teamster's wife had kept on during a wagon train ride. I could not touch it. I could not Xerox any of it because to put it on the Xerox machine might have broken the spine. And I could only turn the pages while wearing a white glove, because even the oil on my fingers could deteriorate the paper, the parchment it was on. but I was allowed a pencil and a notebook that I could copy that information from and dialogue that you record and stuff like that. So that was not unusual to be doing that kind of research back then. Nowadays, many, not only government entities like the Library of Congress and National Archives, but universities, different organizations. There's actually a Jedediah Smith organization, foundation. A lot of stuff has been digitized. And so that pace increases because, as long as funded because it remains available. So to me, the real turning point was when, back in 2017, I was working on the book Valley Forge. And I discovered that you could go on the Library of Congress website and you could read on your home computer every single word George Washington ever wrote. Every letter, his own diaries, everything like that. It's the Library of Congress has it, and it's all digitized. Any presidential address, any memos he wrote as president, as Continental Congress president, things like that. So, even though there's some things that's still waiting to be digitized, there's a lot more information out there. Even diaries kept by a Jim Clavin or Thomas Fitzpatrick, whatever excerpts survived, the Jim Bridger. You can find that information. It still takes a lot of work. It's still detective work, but it's not the dig a trench kind of work that it used to be. So yes, young lady.
How did you meet Lovejoy? And I know that you've collaborated with a lot of different authors, but how did that happen?
Bob and I first kind of crossed paths back in, I'm going to say it was in the 90s, because we were both in the newspaper business. But we didn't really become friends until Bob, for years and years, lived in East Hampton. And we got to know each other better because, anybody remember a watering hole in East Hampton called Nichols? Yeah, you remember that? Okay. Nichols which sadly no longer exists, but at the time, in the 90s and the aughts, it was a favorite watering hole saloon for mostly writers and cops. And so Bob was a regular there, and once we got to be bitter friends, he said, I want to introduce you to a place that, it's like a Cheers kind of situation. So I got to be friends with Bob because we'd see each other 2 or 3 times a week. I was drinking milk, of course, like Jimmy Stewart, pedestrian rides again.
Right, and you're right.
Yeah, and one day, I'd been doing some research on a book of mine that eventually became what was published called Dark Noon. And I was reading about different tragedies at sea. And I was reading a book called In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton of the USS Indianapolis. And there's 3 paragraphs about a typhoon that struck Admiral Halsey's fleet in the Southwest Pacific in December 1944. 3 paragraphs. I'd never heard of this before. And so that day, I popped into Nichols, told Bob about it. He said, never heard before either. Why don't we pitch it to my editor at GQ? Not GQ, he was working for Men's Journal at the time. We got the okay to do an article, eventually that became known as Typhoon Cobra, the very first named typhoon, that hit Halsey's fleet, sank 3 ships, and killed 800 sailors. It was the worst loss of life that the Navy had in World War II. That was midway in the other battle. And so that article got a lot of attention, and it expanded to become our first book together, Halsey's Typhoon, which was published in 2007. And it was a one-off. We weren't anticipating, we just thought we had a good story, and we'll do this story, and then we each he had his magazine work to do, I had other book projects I wanted to do, but, thankfully, very lucky for us, the book, the week after it came out, got on the New York Times bestseller list. Suddenly our agent and our editor are saying, okay, what's next for you fellas? So we've since done Halsey's Typhoon, The Last Stand of Fox Company, Last Men Out, The Heart of Everything That Is, Valley Forge, Lucky 666, Blood and Treasure, Last Hill, and now Blood and Treasure. It's probably someone I'm leaving out, but. So Bob is also one of those people who sanely works on one project at a time. So I can't do that. So that's why the way it usually works, that Bob will do a book together, I do a solo book, we'll do a book together, we do a solo book. So he's much more content to take time off. So that's how we met. And over the years, it's evolved. They never say don't go into business with a friend. When you're doing a book together, which involves contractual stuff and things like that, that's business. But I'm glad to report that over the years, we've become, we're very close friends these days. And, we, also our families have been through a lot together, and, we've been there for each other. So it's one of the relationships I really value. You hear that, Bob? He said he's going to listen to it. Yes?
So you're working on books,
Yeah.
and you have your Southampton press column.
It's only once a month. I've cut back.
For those once every 6 weeks.
Maybe.
Now that Jim died.
Yeah, it is up a little bit.
And you do your email little.
Oh, the
essays.
overlook on Substack.
Yeah. So how do you switch between them all?
I find it, I know this is a little out of the ordinary, I admit that it's unusual, but to me, it's refreshing to switch from project to project over the course of months or years, rather than, I'm working on a book right now, the tentative title is Undefeated, and it's about a World War II submarine that became the most successful submarine in the Pacific theater during the war. And it was on its very last mission, actually it's fired its very last torpedo. And it was a bad torpedo, the boomerang came back and hit their own submarine, and it sank. And some of the crew survived, including the captain. He then had to survive a Japanese prisoner of war camp. So I was working on, so the first thing, like this morning, for example, I was working on some stuff, I'm doing some work with the History Channel. I'm working on some stuff for a show they're doing. Then I switched to the submarine book. Just before I left, I had to go over my notes here and everything here, which I know that. And then when I come back, there's probably going to be some, maybe a chapter that Bob wrote of our next book we're working together. I might have to revise or go through that. Now, for most people, that might sound like it's maddening. I find it refreshing. The worst thing that can happen to me is I'm working on something like this blank space. Throw it.
Go do something else. What do you
What do I
do
do?
for the History Channel?
They have, there's a show coming on the History Channel. They have an initiative that they started called History Salutes, I think it's called History Honors 2025. And it's going to be about 18 months of special programming coinciding with the 250th anniversary of the United States, which is in 2026. Based on the Declaration of Independence, 1776. And so there's going to be different programming there, and they asked me to develop a program that's going to have, that's going to be connected to characters and different themes and events in my books, my Western books. So it hasn't been green-lit yet, they just asked me to develop it, and they're going to see, I think, hopefully by the end of this month, it's going to take it to the next level. Maybe not. But, I just want my one, just give me 10 seconds on the red carpet, that's all. Preferably standing up. Yes, go on, any questions? Yes, sir.
You started by mentioning the mountain men and the fur trapping and all that sort of thing, so certainly we should be more familiar with the fact that the voyagers, whatever, they came and explored, and then they harvested the beavers.
Yes.
And then, those are huge cargoes. How did they get them back before they?
They built what were called pirogues.
What's that?
They built what were called pirogues.
Okay.
These are like canoe type of structures,
Right.
but bigger than those, and flatboats.
Yeah.
Flatboats.
Okay.
And they'd use the waterways.
Okay. I can understand north and south, Mississippi and Missouri. How about east-west?
Well, when at the Continental Divide, sometimes if you got it as far as the other side of the Continental Divide, you had to really haul and drag your catch. But the most fertile parts for finding beaver were in, the mountain north.
Okay.
So on that side of the divide, all the rivers run east. Once you get on the other side of the divide, all the rivers run west.
Yeah.
So you got your boat on the waterways, and you just hopefully didn't crash into anything, and you could, especially once you got to the Missouri, which is like 2,000 miles or something, and you could take your vessel all the way to St. Louis, where you would sell your catch. What eventually happened is by the late 1830s, beaver had been virtually wiped out in America. As usual, just like what happened with the buffalo a couple of decades later. Overfished, over-harvested, and the market in Europe collapsed for beaver pelts and beaver hats. So a lot of these guys, they were out of work. And some of them became Army Scouts, you know, because they could take advantage, Army would take advantage of their knowledge that built up over years. Some of them could retire. Some of them died because, you know, in those days, probably the average lifespan for American male was 50, 47. So, the story basically ends in the early 1830s because from that point on, there was a really steady decline in the mountain ability to make a living. Now, one other quick point about Jedediah Smith that, because usually a question that gets asked is how come we don't know that much about him? What is it about Jedediah Smith that is different, like a Daniel Boone or a Davy Crockett or John Fremont, for example? Well, one thing is he did die relatively young, Jedediah Smith. The other thing is he had nobody that was going to promote him. He never became the subject of dime store novels like Kit Carson did, like Wild Bill Hickok did, like Davy Crockett did. There wasn't any PR campaign to make him a larger-than-life mythical American character. And after he died, what existed of his diary is basically buried in archives. It really wasn't until the mid-20th century that scholars started to find out more about Jed Smith and make a real effort to find out more about him. And books started to be written about Jed Smith. I mean, the very first comprehensive biography, this is not a biography, it's really a biography of an era, not of Jed Smith, but the very first biography of Jed Smith, I think, was published in 1954. So you're talking about, you know, more than 100 years after he passed away. So that's why, to this day, he's not mentioned in the same breath, the same sentence. Also, John C. Fremont's another example. He wrote 3 books based on his adventures, most of them with Kit Carson, that became huge bestsellers in the United States. Now, he didn't tell anybody his wife had written the books. She was the one who was the talented writer in the family, not him. But still, the books came out, they were hugely popular, about all his adventures in the West and exploring the mountains and everything like that, you know, all the way to the East Coast, West Coast. And Jed Smith didn't have that. He didn't have that champion. He didn't have that partner that was going to get his name out there.